Hello. Today we're going to talk about the three sectors in the fields of recreation and physical education. So, within our field, we have the public sector, the not-for-profit sector, and the private sector. So we're going to go through, this lecture is basically discussing what the differences are in these different sectors. At the end of this unit, you need to be able to compare and contrast the different characteristics of these sectors. How are they similar and different from each other? So the first is the private sector, or another word is commercial sector. So this is the portion of the economy where businesses operate with the aim to make profit. That is the whole point of them. So within our field, you can think of many for-profit organizations like Good Life Fitness Center, Walnuts Climbing Place, the professional sports sector, private sports coaching organizations, being a fitness coach, all these things where you are making profit. In contrast, the not-for-profit sector is where organizations and agencies are restricted from actually making profit. They're not allowed to make profit, and that's part of the federal tax code. So organizations in the not-for-profit sector rely on they have to have some way of having money for operating. So either from memberships, like a lot of, you can think of like the YMCA is a not-for-profit, but you still have to pay for a membership, volunteers, and donors as well to carry out their mission and raise funds. They often also use grants. Not-for-profit sector organizations don't collect taxes and often do not pay taxes. And this is unlike the public and private sector organizations, which do pay tax. Examples in our field, I've already mentioned the YMCA, Recreation Newfoundland and Labrador, Sports NL as well, School Sports NL. These are all obviously examples of not-for-profits who also, in those cases, they also work very closely with the public sector. Community centers. McMorran Community Center is an example in St. John's. And then there's the public sector. So this is obviously the government sector. It's supported by the public through property taxes. So it is, the public's money through taxes that goes into running these organizations. And obviously they also still charge fees though as well. But examples then are like St. John's Recreation Division within, the city of St. John's. The Eastern School District, Recreation and Sport Division of Department of Children, Seniors and Social Development within the Newfoundland provincial government. So anything to do with government, education, etc. And many of us will actually end up working in the public sector. I'm sure especially a lot of people who are in physical education who might be going on to Teachers College. So these three sectors of leisure services really overlap then too. And so we're going to talk about how they overlap. And actually, our field is very unique in that no other profession really spans all these sectors. Maybe no other profession except for healthcare requires the diversity needed, to be able to manage all these different sectors. So obviously, some of you might be going into, for example, you want to be a physiotherapist or occupational therapist, or therapeutic recreation specialist. All these would obviously fall into healthcare within the public sector. And there's also examples of all of those being public, not-for-profit, or private. So these three sectors in our field coexist. We have, for example, if you think of recreation, there's federal, provincial, and municipal governments focus on parks. That's the public. There's also municipal government, which is public, that provides park and recreation services. There's nonprofits that provide, leisure, social, or sport-based leisure services where governments are unwilling or maybe unable. And there's obviously businesses that also identify with this and provide services and products that the public is willing to pay for. And they're usually things then that aren't available in the not-for-profit and public sectors. And as I already mentioned, no other profession except for healthcare really spans the number of sectors we have. And so you really need to have a diversity in administration, organization, and financial skills. The business models of the three sectors vary, but we also know that nonprofits are increasingly operating for-profit operations. Well, how is that possible? How can a not-for-profit be making profit? Well, these are what's called social enterprises. And so not-for-profits are sometimes operating businesses to make profit, and that money, though, goes right back into the organization. The most largest example we have in St. John's is the nonprofit Stella's Circle. It operates the Hungry Heart Cafe, which is a social enterprise. The cafe provides industry training and employment, and the profits of the restaurant go back into Stella's Circle to help fund their other programs and services for people who are low income and have maybe a lot of mental health issues as well. Another example is the pantry run by the Autism Society. You are paying for your lunch. They're making a profit on that, and they also are providing employment for people with autism in there. And then also it's, the money then is going back into the Autism Society. The three sectors, though, operate differently. They don't really operate under the same accounting principles. They have different tax laws, different levels of transparency to follow. For example, in the public and not-for-profit, accounting is publicly available, but you can't Google and find a private or commercial sectors or organizations financial information. And you'll learn for people who move on to take HKR 3100, Advanced Organization and Administration. In that course, we focus a lot on the finance differences. The three sectors also have different organizational and administration structures. For example, not-for-profits are run by a board of directors, who meet regularly throughout the year. A part of that board is the executive director, and the executive director is the person who's in charge, of the organization. But technically, they aren't the head is the board of directors. The private sector is organized depending on the size of the organization. You could have, be a sole owner, or have just a couple of employees, or you could operate a very large organization that has presidents, corporate boards. It could even have stocks available, etc. And also, the private sector organization and structure really depends on the public sector really depends on the municipal and provincial governments. What's also odd is in our field, the three sectors can compete with each other, even if it seems like they shouldn't. And, sometimes it's good for people, participants, customers, to have these different options depending on what you're looking for. And also, for example, not everyone can afford recreation, leisure, sport, etc. in the private sector. But they can also compete and take away business from each other. And if you really think of a fitness center can operate in all three sectors. A fitness center is an example that distinguishes the challenges of managing in all three sectors, because you have many similarities, but unique administration and management practices and political realities, really. So in a fitness example, for example, you have the YMCA that is not for profit. You then have the commercial sector like gyms. And then we also have the public sector that also offers, fitness classes and that sort of thing as well. And maybe even a public weight, area to like resistance training as well. But usually the three sectors don't compete, and that's because they have different missions or objectives, which we'll talk about in a moment. And they really do, though, or they should at least, they're focusing on meeting the customer or target market needs. So in the commercial sector, the private sector, the private sector of recreation and physical education service is massive. In 2006, Parks and Recreation magazine estimated that the commercial sector of the U.S. economy provides about 6.5 million jobs. And I can't locate a Canadian stat on that. And that's in part because it's very difficult to define the commercial sector. If you include, for example, tourism, it becomes really massive. So private services are obviously creative and very diverse. If you include tourism in this, and culture, there's a lot. So, for example, Disney World is probably, one of the biggest destinations, like leisure destinations, and that's the commercial sector. We could include that in, amusement parks and that sort of thing. You also have like tourism, going to visit, obviously in Newfoundland, that is a massive sector. Now, some people might actually you're more likely to go specialize in that area. But even nowadays we have, people might take someone, be hired to be a guide for fishing or hiking and that sort of thing. We also have like the camping sector, and often some camps might be run. You even have like the cruise line industry, and obviously a lot of fitness is big money nowadays. But there's really creativity. Creativity is the hallmark of the public and commercial services. So as I said, this is massive area. You can have travel and tourism. You could also consider restaurants to be part of the commercial sector here as well. It is a leisure activity, to go and eat. Often also events are often around food. Gambling can also be considered a leisure sector. So although usually, that's kind of viewed as its own thing, but, there are, like, think of pubs and stuff. They increasingly are having these machines in there. Professional sports is obviously a really big aspect, and maybe something that some of you are interested in going into. Movies, entertainment, even the book industry, shopping. Shopping is sometimes a leisure activity for people, but also you have to buy the goods and services. Think about your recreation, leisure and sports. Think about the money you have spent on the goods, like on the equipment, lessons, all that sort of thing. So goods and retail is also part of this sector. Then we have the not-for-profit sector. It is also pretty large. According to a stat I've found from in 2005, which is a bit old, but 170,000 not-for-profit or voluntary organizations in Canada. In the US, it is estimated to be 1.8 million organizations. And in Canada, our not-for-profit sector employs 2 million people. Most of these people are employed in very large not-for-profit organizations. There's tons of small not-for-profits, but really large organizations, for example, like the Arthritis Society, or I'm thinking, things that have a national body to them. And they may have provincial divisions as well. But not-for-profit in our area, like think of All Coaching. A lot of children's sports are all not-for-profit based. Most of the coaches are volunteering their time. Other things like Jumpstart, or organizations that help. Jumpstart helps to provide sports equipment and to children low income. And then you can think of actually the Aqua Arena and the Works is a not-for-profit organization. Not-for-profits are exempt from paying taxes under the Income Tax Act of Canada. And in order to be considered a not-for-profit organization, you have to be organized exclusively for the purpose of either social welfare, civic improvement, pleasure, recreation, or any other purpose except for profit. And there's another category for religious not-for-profits as well. And it's actually fairly easy to actually establish a not-for-profit. You have to have a board of directors, which must consist of 3 members, which is the executive director, the secretary, and the treasurer. You need to have a mission statement, and you need to have policies and regular meetings for an annual general meeting, and you have to, complete your treasury reports. And you just fill out a form to do this, and you pay. Last I checked, it was around $75. Go to you just go to, in St. John's, you just go to Confederation Building and pay this, and that's it. And if you, especially, it's pretty easy if you have a very small organization. Obviously, the more money that you have in the bank account, the more difficult it is, and especially when you get into having employees and that kind of thing. So these use a combination of employees and volunteers as staff usually. There are a difference for charitable status. So not all not-for-profits are charity, okay? So charitable status is special. So you do have to be usually you're a not-for-profit, but then they may or may not have charitable status. And that means that people can donate to the organization and deduct the donations from their gross income when they fill their tax income. So, as an example, in Canada, you need to provide a donation of around, I think it's $25 minimum, to a charitable organization in order to be able to claim it on your income tax. But usually, when you're giving money, they're not charitable status, and you can't claim that. Not-for-profits are more and more operating as a quasi-business, as I've mentioned before, or often what's called a social enterprise. So they make a profit, but they reinvest that money into the expansion of other areas of the organization. So in not-for-profit sector, the word profit is not allowed, really. It's called surplus money. So the surplus money, or it's called excessive revenues over expenditures. Okay, in the private sector we call this profit, but in the not-for-profit sector this is viewed as excessive revenues. So they're not allowed to make that. They have to then take that money and put it back into things that help to maintain the organization, and that could be like helping to build a new building. It could be hiring staff. There aren't particular rules about it, but the money can't be used to be making profit or give people bonuses. So in the not-for-profit sector, financial management really focuses on managing revenues and expenses so the organization will have enough revenue to cover expenses or invest back. There's different accounting rules that have to be followed, and reports have to be submitted to government agencies. Not-for-profit organizations have to be operated, by a board of directors, and so the organization and reporting rules have to be followed. Then we have the public sector government, and this really forms the cornerstone of people employed in the field of recreation and physical education. Many of you will go into public sector jobs. So it might be a municipal level job like St. John's. It could be a provincial job like Newfoundland and Labrador, or, for example, the Newfoundland and Labrador English School District or some other type of school board, or it could be a federal position. Now, in Canada, we do have federal education jobs in the government, but in Canada, parks and recreation and sport are primarily operated at the provincial level. There is no federal organization level. There is Parks Canada, though. So parks are operated at the federal level, but there aren't things really to do with like sports and recreation or that sort of thing. So within the public sector, the federal, provincial, and municipal sectors differ. They differ in terms of their mission as well as their revenue, how they actually get money to operate. So the mission at the federal level is mostly to maintain national parks, forest, and protected and historic areas. So, for example, in Newfoundland and Labrador, we have federal parks. We also have major, national historic and cultural sites. For example, Signal Hill is operated federally, not provincially. At the provincial level, the mission is to maintain provincial parks and provincial protected and historic areas and trail systems. It's also usually, for example, in terms of recreation and leisure, it's the promoting of provincial sport and recreation. But mostly we operate at the municipal level. So that's, parks and open spaces, indoor and outdoor recreation facilities, leisure and recreation programs and services, sports, etc. In terms of revenue, at the federal level, it's user fees like admission to camping, and also federal tax dollars. At the provincial level, it's also user fees and provincial tax dollars. And at municipal level, same thing, it's user fees, but also municipal tax instead of provincial. What's most important in the public sector in terms of finances and governance is transparency. So what is transparency? It's the concept that an entity is, in financial, accounting, legal terms, an organization, a unit that is a legal organization or business. That is not hiding things, that you're being transparent in its financial position and because you could be hurt. Otherwise, you're misrepresenting yourself. And there's laws about this. Laws adopted require most information to be made public, meetings to be announced and take place in public, and bidding to be competitive by individuals or companies doing business with governmental units. So, for example, if the government is deciding to make a new recreation center, they have to have transparency in that they have to make it a competition that's public as to who's going to get the contract, like the construction company, to actually make the building. So that's publicly announced. It even has to go in the newspaper. There's like rules about where it has to be advertised. And then there's bids. And then depending on, well, they might say they look at other factors, but to be honest, usually they're looking at who's going to have the cheapest one. And also because the money to run the public sector comes from taxes, that's why they need to be transparent. And as I said, usually not-for-profits are also transparent as well, mostly. They have to report some of it. So there are also challenges as a manager in these three sectors. Managers in our field are especially vulnerable to changes in the economy and political environment. So there's different threats. During economic downturn, people have less disposable money. So that means in the private sector, you're not buying things. You're not going to pay for different recreation, leisure, and sports services because you don't have the money. Also, during economic downtime, there's less government funding. So often recreation and leisure are cut, or their budget does not grow. And although I do not know as much about the education sector, I imagine this is also true there. The political environment changes. So depending what type of politics are going on, who, for example, the premier is, or who is the mayor, those two governments change, and that also changes politics and financial things. It doesn't affect the commercial sector quite as much unless there was maybe taxes and that kind of thing. But obviously, in the public sector, it changes because maybe what's important changes depending on who's in charge. Also, it might change not-for-profit in that, you're not going to have, maybe there aren't as many grants, depending on who is, running. And if the revenues to participants, ratio is low and falls short of covering expenses, that can obviously, be an issue. That's the major thing for the public sector. For the private commercial sector, when people, aren't actually, you're not making profit. And then there can also, another threat is competition. And obviously, you generally think of that more, that there's competition in the private sector. But as I've mentioned, because of the overlap in our field, we really do have competition between all three sectors. There's also similarities and differences in management of the sectors. Obviously, the services between these sectors are sometimes exactly the same, and the skills that you need in order to be successful are often very similar. But many of the services and programs are different, and there can be, different management skills. So I'm going to go through that now. So management of the three sectors has, slight differences. At the commercial or, private sector, it's really obviously focused on making profit. So you really need to understand the marketing approach. The product or service is designed around the customer's needs. You're trying to get them to buy your product or service. The price and product or service really define the market niche. So, whether you're, going for the gold star elite market, or maybe middle of the road. And also promoting the product or service can have its challenges. People don't necessarily know that you exist, so you have to be doing promotion a lot. Obviously, in the commercial, the focus is on profit, so it increases the focus on the customer. So you're really caring about customers' needs. And if you're not, then you're not going to make profit. There's less transparency. They don't need to proprietary financial information, meaning it's, you don't have to report. The only time that commercial sector has to report things is if they are have stocks and that sort of thing. They do have to share their information to their stockholders. And obviously, it's focused on a marketing approach. That means your 4 Ps: product, price, position, and promotion. And there's a lot of risk in the commercial sector. With no taxes or donations to sustain a business, there's no safety net. Also, customer needs change, and you have to evolve as a business. And obviously, there's a higher threat of competition. In the not-for-profit sector, you're really focusing on fundraising. Fundraising is a requirement and a primary managerial responsibility. For example, the executive director at McMorran Community Center does a lot of grant writing. He told me that he probably writes around 30 different grant applications a year. Not-for-profit managers also are required to seek donations to support their organizations operating in capital financial needs. For really, really large not-for-profits, that is, there are that's a big job. There are people who make a lot of money being specifically looking at fundraising. There still has to be some sort of revenue stream or engine has to be developed, whether, in order to support your operating expenses. Sometimes you have to manage members. So, how much things charge is very important. Think of like Boys and Girls Club. I know that they mostly do it for free for people who can't, but, it's like a $4 membership or something. Providing services to those who can't pay can be required. It might be in your mission statement. So therefore, you might have to be making enough money or fundraising in order to be able to provide these programs and services or membership free to those in need. For example, that's what the YMCA does. Provides reduced cost. There's more transparency than in the business sector, than in commercial, but not as much as in public. And you have to motivate staff through other sources than salary, because usually they are not the highest salary in not-for-profit, generally, especially not in recreation, leisure, and physical education. So people are doing that because they love the job. So in public management, there's also a political dimension to managing. So you really need to understand politics and what's going on. Things change depending on, for example, who is the mayor, or who is in charge of division, or, for example, at the provincial level, which party is in. Transparency is supposed to be almost total, and that's what most of CBC News and NTV, it's mostly about trying to find when a government isn't transparent. And employees often have very high rights, and they're often unionized. For example, generally speaking, there's very good at least a pension plan and that sort of thing. There's a lot of pension protection. And tax funding has been reduced or stayed the same over many years. So what I mean by that is that in public sector, especially in recreation and leisure, the operating budget given to the Recreation and Leisure Division is usually the same. So, and that's also a problem. Like, it's usually our services that tend to get cut in budget or never added to, which really needs to change because, in a way, if you think about it, recreation and leisure and sport and all these types of activities, social participation, are important for our physical and mental well-being of individuals in the community, and also, therefore, help us to be productive in our jobs, reduce financial burden. We have help to reduce healthcare costs, etc. I could go on. So we really need to show how our field is like maybe one of the most important, and in addition to education. So there are then a lot of skills needed for managing leisure services, and we'll be talking about that in the next unit on management competencies. But all of these sectors, generally, you need to have universal management skills. What are these? Well, you need to have good communication skills. You need to have knowledge and training in economics, finance, politics, often psychology and sociology about the individuals, and also organizational behavior, like understanding organizations. But they do have different skills. So in the private sector, you obviously need the ability to make profit is the key. Nonprofit sector, you need to be able to raise funds. You need to do grant writing. You need to manage volunteers, and you have to know how to work with a board of directors. Where in the public sector, it's really a lot about navigating the political process and bureaucracy, and also the importance of being transparent. So these are the three sectors of recreation and physical education. And it's important to understand then the difference between these sectors, as well as the similarities and differences and how they are, especially how they are similar and different in terms of management.